So the power went out in the tiny house, and it's daylight, obviously, because if it wasn't, it would be pitch dark. So I really do like to think about what would ever happen if we were to get into a situation where we have a long-term power outage of a couple days or maybe even a week. And I think this is really important for everyone to give a little bit of thought to, no matter what time of year, because I think, and I'm going to try not to make this sound too doom and gloom, but I think that as climate change begins to, or progresses more, I should say, I think power outages are going to become very common when there is extreme weather. So that is when it is the coldest parts of winter and the hottest parts of summer. So I think that it's really important for everyone, no matter your living situation, to start thinking about what would you do if the power was out for a day, for 2 days, for 4 days, And some of the things to think about are really interesting. So, as some of you may know, I lived off grid for all of last year. So, last year I was completely off grid. The tiny house did not have any power at all. And the benefit, I think, of living off grid for a little while is that you really become really resilient, you know? And the nice thing about previously living off grid is that a lot of those systems that are still in place are still in place. So during a long-term power outage, it is wintertime, and my main concern is heat for my house. That is easily solved. I heat with my wood stove, even though I do have power and I do have a baseboard heater for, backup. Or if I'm away from the house, I can turn my baseboard heater on and know that my pets are still going to have heat, and that's fine. But I do still, by and large, heat my home with the wood stove. So I have wood storage, I have wood stored up. It's fine. I just have to make sure during a power outage that if I don't have extra batteries for my lantern, for example, like this one, and I don't have extra batteries right now, that I'm making sure that I have enough wood stored up on my porch, like on my deck, to last me through the night in case the power outage continues to be out, right? So that is how the heat situation is solved. In terms of summer, in the height of summer, like air conditioning can be a bit of an issue. Around here, we are lucky enough to not live in the city, so we don't have cement that just traps the heat, I don't live in a city apartment, which I'm very grateful for. And so if the power outage happens in the middle of summer and it's too hot, it's easy to just walk down, to the river and jump in or dip your feet in or whatever, right? So I'm mostly worried about making sure that things are warm enough in the winter versus cool enough in the summer. So that's how we solve our issue of heat. Our next issue is the issue of water. So on the property, we do have a well, but our well does not work when there is no power. We do have a filter, and I'm gonna have to check actually if the filter still works without power, because we basically have the reason we have a filter is because the water that comes out of our well is full of uranium, like a lot of uranium, like 700 times or something. Okay, maybe not 700. I don't know. 7 times maybe what your body can handle. So we had to buy a really high quality filter, and that is in my parents' house. It's just an attachment that is on your sink, and that filter has a tank. I think it's a 5-liter tank. So it stores water. So it stores 5 liters of water. And I'll have to ask my stepdad if it works when the power is out. So after I make this video, I'm going to run over there and see if it still works. Because if it does, then my parents have 5 liters of like drinking water essentially, or potentially washing water, right? Um, I also have, this is my water jug, because even though I have power in the tiny house now, I will never have running water. The tiny house, it was built to be a dry cabin, so I don't have water. So this stores up to 2 liters of water, which isn't a whole lot of water. I would say that I burn through this in, I don't know, 2 or 3 days maybe. So that's not terrible. But again, the reason that this lasts maybe 2 or 3 days is because I'm not using it for washing water. So in an extended power outage, I would have to likely pick up water from somewhere. Most likely, I'd have to walk down to the nearest river. We do have a huge 5 liter gallon, or 5 liter gallon. Is it gallons or liters? I don't know. It's a lot though. It's like a big water thing. It's on wheels. It's great. So in the event of an extended power outage lasting, several days where I needed washing water, I would most likely during the day walk to the nearest stream or the nearest river, because that you could probably drink it. You'd probably have to boil it first. So if we needed extra washing or extra drinking water, we could do that. We'd have to boil it first, but in terms of washing, it's probably fine around here to use the creeks and whatnot. Otherwise, I just filled this up. So this is full, which is nice. So the power will most likely come on sometime today, but even if it doesn't come on till later, it's fine. So now that we have heat covered, we have water covered, and the next thing to start thinking about is food and how we're going to cook it. Now, for me, that's easy. I have a wood stove. Boom, there you go, problem solved. I can cook on my wood stove. My parents also have a wood stove for their house. And they can cook on that wood stove, but they have to get that wood stove really, 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 really hot in order to cook on it. And it's not, because their stove is more built like a furnace, it's not great to cook on. Can they cook on it? Yes. They could simmer a stew or something on it, which is similar to how I use my wood stove, right? So in terms of cooking, I'm limited with the wood stove, right? Again, to more stew-like items, boiling water on the wood stove. I can heat water for my tea. It takes a long time. It takes an hour and a half, and it will never reach a full boil. But I can heat water for my tea on the wood stove. So in the event that I did not have propane, now I do have a small camp stove on the deck of my tiny house that's hooked up to a very small propane tank. It is a 5-pound propane tank. But that propane lasts a very long time. It costs me around $7 to fill up the whole thing. It used to cost a little bit closer to $5, but I think I don't know, inflation, whatever. It costs now a little bit closer to $7, which is still fine. And that propane, even if I'm cooking on it every day, still lasts me a good 2 to 3 months. So I just filled up my propane tank literally yesterday. So, we could cook for the entire household, both my house and also my parents' house on the propane. We can cook whatever. So that solves how we would cook our food during an extended power outage. But the thing about not having power is that your fridges don't work, obviously. Food storage becomes a huge problem when you don't have power. And food storage would be the main thing that I would be concerned about, because I no longer have, I own a cooler, I have a cooler, but when I lived off grid, it was fine. I knew that my ice would stay good in my cooler for at least a couple of days. But even with my cooler, it's still, your cooler operates much differently than a refrigerator. I was never fully comfortable, I guess, storing my leftovers in my cooler. Anyway, so yeah, so food storage. That is really the main concern. Now, if we were to have a power outage, let's say for like maybe a week or so, right? Then we would just cook small enough meals that we wouldn't have to store them. We would just make sure that we cooked essentially enough food so that I wouldn't necessarily have to store leftovers, in a cooler. But even if you have a cooler, I didn't trust the cooler as much with like fresh meat and whatnot, and so like food safety definitely becomes a little bit more of a concern in terms of an extended power outage. So, if we had an extended power outage, we would probably try and eat a little bit more dry goods. We'd probably eat more vegetarian, or we would eat more smoked meats. So, bacon, that sort of stuff that we wouldn't have to worry as much about like, food storage and food safety. Honestly, when I lived off grid, the thing that I wished for the most was a refrigerator. Because, yeah, oh my gosh, a fridge just made so much easier. Oh, I think the power just popped on. Hold on. Ah, there we go. Power. Ta-da! Hello, camera. Focus, please. There we go. So the power popped back on. The reason I knew the power actually came back on was because I saw the light on my fridge as I was talking about my fridge. So my light on my fridge popped back on. Okay, there we go. That's better. Now you can actually see me. It was just starting to get like dark. It's only 1 o'clock, but it's quite cloudy, so so now the power's back on. We'll still continue to talk about how we would kind of deal with an extended power outage. Another thing to kind of think about, other than, so we have our heat figured out, our water figured out, and our food, kind of, sort of. During an extended power outage, we would most likely have to like drive somewhere and get more food. Because like I keep, a fair amount of food. Like I could probably survive off of, pancakes. I have a good recipe for like vegan pancakes. So there's no eggs and no milk. It's just like water and flour and vanilla and all of that. So, like if I had to, I probably have enough dry goods in my house that I could survive off of, at least a couple days, maybe even several days if I had to. But in terms of food around here, when there is a power outage, the local grocery store does close. And the reason that they do that is because no generator is big enough for them to operate all of their fridges and freezers, right? Because they've got like walk-in like fridges, they've got like walk-in freezers, they've got everything a grocery store like needs, right? So during a power outage, the grocery store does close, which is just more reason to have, food in your house. So, we could easily survive off of the food in our houses, both my house and my mom's house, for probably at least a week, maybe more. Obviously, we wouldn't really have fresh food, right? We would be eating a lot of canned food. But again, that as long as we had a way to like preserve our leftovers, or we would just find a way to cook food that didn't have as many leftovers. We would essentially be surviving off of like bread and pancakes. Like, we do have like, potatoes, right? And we have eggs from the chickens that we would get fresh all the time. So we'd probably just survive off of that, which would be all right. Okay, so we talked about heat, we talked about water, we talked about food storage, we talked a little bit about like the grocery store and stuff. In terms of like my vehicle, right? Because when the power goes out, another thing that doesn't happen is gas around here. It doesn't happen. It's like at all. Gas stations, um, gas stations will generally close as well because again, they can't pump their gas without power. And again, there's no generator large enough for them to, do that. So it's always important when for me anyway, to always make sure I have gas in my car. So my current gas tank, I have just over half a tank. I usually try and keep my tank more full than half, right? Because at least on half a tank of gas, I can drive far enough that I can get outside of our like local area. And, like the city is an hour away, for example. And if we don't have power, chances are the city does. So, I always make sure that there's a little bit of gas. Now, if we're dealing with a power outage lasting several months, that's a different story, right? But, I mean, several days to a week would be when most power outages would last. So that's how we would get, our heat, our water, our food storage, and our transportation, right? Otherwise, if we didn't have access to transportation, like if we didn't have access to our vehicles for whatever reason, maybe there's no gas or whatever, we do live within walking distance of a river. It's a bit of a long walk, like it would take some time, but it's not an unreasonable walk, really. We also do have a creek on our property that we could probably, possibly otherwise, our other house, so we have a well on the property, which obviously doesn't work when there is a power outage because our well is like 450 feet deep. So, but our other house, which is the house that my parents lived in before they built their new house, the water to that house is fed by a spring, and there is a pump as well. But that pump just basically helps the water along. Actually, the pump gets the water up to the second floor. So when there is no power, there wouldn't be water up to the second floor. However, there would be water still running on the first floor. So the first floor would always have water in the main house because it is a gravity fed spring, which is really nice. So our option would be for water would be either to, if we had to, we could walk to a nearby river, or we could just walk down to the main house. Like if there were a super extended power outage, that's tricky because I wouldn't want to live in the other house because the other house doesn't have a wood stove. Like both my house and my parents' houses, like both have wood stoves, but our other house on the property does not. So we would probably just like take our water jugs every few days or so and like walk down to the main house and, get water from the tap from the main house from the gravity fed spring. Obviously, if there's no power, there wouldn't be hot water because the hot water tank wouldn't run. There'd be hot water for a little bit, but otherwise, nothing like that. So that's essentially how we would survive in the event of a more long-term power outage. Not a whole lot changes right here when there is a power outage. Obviously there's no power, so there's no internet. It's just the same thing. We light the wood stove. I continue to have tea while heating water on my propane stove. So, there is a lot of options. That is the nice thing about, living in the countryside where you have access to more natural resources. I would recommend that if you do live in the city, though, that you give some thought to what you would do if there is a long-term power outage like that. Would you have to leave the city? Probably. Where would you go? Do you have relatives? Do you have a summer cottage? Like, what would you do? If you are planning on to stay in the city, where would you get your fresh water from? Where would you, and this is gross, but it's incredibly important, where would you go to the toilet where you will not make yourself or other people sick? That is very important. Now, the nice thing about living off grid is that I learned a lot about composting toilets, and literally just a bucket with some sawdust, which I still have a bunch of sawdust left over from last year. So if I have to, we would just use the composting toilet again, which is a bucket with some sawdust, right? But in the city, like going to the bathroom, so important. I mean, like obviously it's important for like a bodily function, but the reason it's important is because you can make yourself so sick if you don't deal with your waste appropriately. Now, for us, our property is large enough that we could probably, if it were like a long term thing, like several months, which hopefully that doesn't happen, but we could easily dig an outhouse just with like shovels. And we would probably do that for an extra long term solution. But in terms of just a week, like composting toilet, a bucket, and, some sawdust. But if you're in the city, how would you? Like if you're in the city and you're experiencing an extended power outage for a couple of days or maybe even a week, where are you going to go to the washroom where you're not going to make yourself and others sick? That is because, like, personally, I don't even know where I would do that in the city. Like, have no clue. So going to the bathroom, another super good thing to think about. We have naturally pretty good first aid kits out here. I have a really good first aid kit in my car, right? So also something to think about if there's an extended power outage, just having a first aid kit, on you. But if you live in the city and you're planning on staying in the city, like, do you have a way to cook your food without electricity? Now, if you have a barbecue, chances are you're fine. If you have a more fancy barbecue, like my parents have this really nice barbecue where it's a barbecue, but with like an extra like burner on the side. And my parents got that for the same reason in the event of a power outage. And that extra burner works the same as my little camp stove that's on the deck of my tiny house. You can just like put a pan on it or a pot of water or whatever, right? And you can use that. Mine's much more efficient, of course, because mine's really small. So if you have a barbecue, especially barbecue with a little burner, like you'll be fine. But otherwise, yeah, are you going to stay in the city? Are you going to leave the city? And it's good to have those sort of plans like in place, If you had to leave the city very suddenly, and let's say there's a blackout throughout the entire city and there's no gas stations open, do you have at least half a tank of gas in your vehicle where you can get out of the city to wherever you're going to, that vacation property or whatever. Anyway, food for thought. Definitely good to think about these about these things. And the power's back on now, so I don't know what I'm gonna do. Maybe edit the video that I had been planning on editing before the power went out.